If I can ask everybody to be seated, and if we can have your attention, we'll get underway. Thanks again, everyone, for being with us here at Eckstein Hall, Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher. As you know, this is On the Issues. This is our series of continuing conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting work in this region and beyond. Today, we are joined by retired General James Jones. General Jones is the former Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, the former Supreme Allied Commander for NATO, and from 2009 to 2010, he was the National Security Advisor to President Obama. Won't you please give him a warm welcome to Marquette University Law School. General Jones has a firm called Jones International Group. They do consulting work on foreign policy issues, on national security issues, and energy security issues. And today, we're going to spend much of this conversation talking about the subject of energy security, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on the Keystone Pipeline XL project. But I want to begin with something that is related to that conversation, the conversation about energy security, General. And I want to talk to you about what's happening in Ukraine and what we've seen on the part of Russia and its president, Vladimir Putin. What do you make of his fairly aggressive stance towards Ukraine?
Well, I think the Russian president's behavior is entirely predictable. I've had the opportunity to be around him and around his colleagues, and you generally get a sense of the man on how he thinks. And, you know, frankly, as a former KGB agent, he has always regretted the demise of the Soviet Union. He believes that that's the worst thing that's ever happened on the face of the planet. He's also very bitter about the fact that so many of the former Warsaw Pact countries joined NATO, which he took as an additional slap in the Russian face. And frankly, he's the kind of guy that, and maybe you've met this kind of man, but I mean, the kind of guy who needs an enemy to make himself look good. And you know, he just needs to have somebody that he can demonize, and there's no better target in his mind than the United States. That's the way he is. That's who he is, and we shouldn't be surprised by how he thinks.
What do you think is the end game here for him? I saw the Prime Minister of Ukraine was on Meet the Press yesterday and said that he believes that Putin dreams of restoring the Soviet Union. Do you think that's far-fetched?
No, I think he'd like to. I think even he realizes that that's probably out of the question. I mean, I was in Warsaw, Poland 10 days ago, and I guarantee you the Poles have no intention of rejoining the Russian orbit. But there's no question that he thinks he can do some of that in Central Asia, in the Crimea, and you know, he may be agitating things in the Ukraine just so he can have a fallback position and show that he's a good guy. You say, okay, we'll put that off to later, because I guarantee you, I mean, he doesn't want to take on the Ukraine's economic difficulties and everything else that goes with it, because Russia can't afford it, to be honest with you. But so this is a cat and mouse game with him. He's very transactional in how he thinks, and he's very strategic in how he thinks. So you can bet that the Crimea thing didn't just come up the day after the Olympics, you know, because by accident. You know, he's a strategic thinker. He's got his ways of looking at the world, and he's got his ways of figuring out what he can do to at least restore some of the lost luster of Russia as a superpower, which it isn't, by the way, except with nuclear weapons. But you know, it's a second-rate economy, and it's certainly going downhill in terms of democracy. So,
Vice President Biden is in Kiev today for meetings. We've also implemented some sanctions against Russia. Is this enough to change his behavior? Our trying to show that we're in support of Ukraine and the sanctions that we've undertaken. Is it enough?
I mean, to me, it's really interesting to just how quickly and how much the world has changed in the last 15 or 20 years. In the 20th century, if Russia had done this, I mean, NATO would be conducting military exercises. We'd be moving troops all over Europe. We'd be dusting off the triad. Nuclear submarines would be patrolling the coast, and the bombers would be practicing ready alerts and all that. It's really interesting to me that really the primary response so far has been mostly about economic issues, and that's not a bad thing, because that really is one of Russia's and Putin's vulnerable points. Energy has an awful lot to do with the potential of our international response to the Soviet Union, or to the Russians, sorry, the Russian Federation, and under Mr. Putin's leadership. Europe is overly dependent on Russian energy, and a strategic response that I think the United States could lead, if it wanted to, internationally, is to form a long-term economic policy that reduces European dependence on Russian energy. The tit for tat, back and forth, we're going to call back our 2 diplomats, you'll call back 3, we're not going to give you visas. I mean, that's all, sophomoric. But the strategic aspect of what we could do is very important, and in a very, very unusual way, the whole thing of the Keystone Pipeline ties into that, because Mr. Putin has calculated that we made a serious mistake in Syria by not responding more aggressively, and he's going to keep pushing until we do something that says, oh, that hurts, and then he'll stop. I mean, that's what it's going to take. But to do nothing and to be wishy-washy and to take it to the United Nations and talk about it and do very little is not the way to deal with the Russian president, this particular Russian president.
I want to follow up on what you just said, but for the audience in this room, one more question about Europe's dependence on Russian natural gas and oil. Describe for people here just how dependent these nations are.
Well, the average is for Europe is about 30%, some higher, some lower, but it's not insignificant. And a few times in the last decade, Mr. Putin has decided to show the Europeans just how dependent they are by shutting off some pipelines. And it got real cold in Europe, very quickly. So it is, in a way, Mr. Putin quite accidentally has given us an opportunity. And the opportunity is really centers around 3 areas: the United States, the European Union, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So with regard to the European Union and NATO, these are 2 organizations that have never really figured out a way to peacefully coexist at the political level. At the military level, there's no problem. I mean, the troops are all the same troops from the same countries. We have the same membership. But at the political level, NATO and the EU has never really figured out how to peacefully coexist, so to speak. The United States has been signaling a pivot towards Asia, which the Europeans have interpreted as a pivot away from them. By the way, so have the Arabs, so have the Africans, so have the South Americans. So maybe that was not perhaps the best term to use. But this crisis, if it doesn't bring NATO and the EU together and us as part of the transatlantic community, and the Canadians, I might add, as a NATO country, then I don't know what it's going to take, because this is serious. It's not life-threatening as we know it. It is an opportunity for Americans to see whether the Europeans are really serious about doing things that are in their own interest before they call on us to bail them out. or to back them up, which we should do. But this is a moment in time where you can really realign some of the priorities. The European funding for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is woefully unacceptable, somewhere on the average of about 1.3% of each country's GDP, and there are 28 countries in NATO now. So they can fix a lot of things on this crisis, using this crisis. And this is not something that Mr. Putin intentionally did. If he sees the revitalization of NATO, some backbone in the EU, and the United States becoming more of a influence in the transatlantic link, those are things that he would think about twice before trying another Ukraine, Crimea.
Let me continue down this path. As you talk about the role that the U.S., for instance, could play in perhaps providing greater energy independence for Europe, that's something down the road, right? I mean, right now we cannot ship natural gas. We cannot export oil to these countries. That's something that we would have to change policy. It's something we would have to look at a few years down the road.
Yeah, because, I mean, we're just a few years away from people who were talking about peak oil. And so obviously, if you're importing, so much oil, why would you export it? It doesn't make sense. But those days, that was then and this is now. And with our potential natural wealth aligned with Canada's interest and Mexico's interest, you actually have the formation of a North American energy powerhouse that will significantly exert its influence on the world, and not only the developed countries, but the developing countries for the foreseeable future. This is an astoundingly good news story for Americans. It needs to be better understood, and I think our elected politicians ought to do a much better job of explaining exactly what it means, because it's potentially transformational. As I said, the range of threats that face us in the 21st century so far are largely economic in nature, competitive in nature. We had a lot to do with creating the world of the 20th century and how it ended with the successful Cold War conclusion. And now it's a new century, and things like cybersecurity, energy security, economic security, those kinds of things are the new family of threats that have to be dealt with. It's not to say that the armed forces won't play a significant role. It's just that, in my view, our engagement in the world is going to be more holistic, whole of government, whole of society, where security, economic development, governance, and rule of law become kind of a triad for American engagement. We're the only country in the world that can do this as well. The Chinese have no interest in doing it. They're purely exploiting places like Africa. We have it when we engage much more holistically. Security is extremely important. You can't have anything without it, so that's a big piece. But if you could marry it up with economic development and governance and rule of law, and with the assets that we have, particularly in the energy field, we can make a big difference in the 21st century. And by the year 2050, we could be as relevant on the global playing field as we were in 1950 from a military economic power viewpoint.
And much of this driven by energy. And yet you said to me when we were upstairs before we came down here that America really doesn't have an energy policy, really has never had an energy policy.
Well, when I first started paying attention to energy, I remember the year, it was 1973. I was a captain in the Marine Corps, and I was living up in Washington, D.C., and I had to get down to the Amphibious Warfare School at Quantico, which was roughly a 35-mile drive. I had a little red Volkswagen Beetle that I could barely afford.
I don't see you in a little red Volkswagen Beetle. I don't know.
I was certainly thinner then. But I remember getting up at 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning to drive to a gas station and queue up to get 5 gallons of gas. And I remember listening to my little squawky AM radio, listen to the president then say, never again will be dependent on foreign oil. And no administration, no Republican, no Democratic administration, has ever comprehensively addressed the issue of energy. And where we are now, and the good news period that we're entering into, has more to do with private sector technology and innovation and just good old American know-how than any comprehensive strategic thinking that has gone into energy. And it's happened very quickly. It's a wonderful opportunity for our country, and I think we should make sure that as citizens that we communicate the desire that this be done very well to our elected representatives. Now, the obvious question is, well, we have a Department of Energy. And the answer to that is yes, we do. And we have a Secretary of Energy, and actually we have a good Secretary of Energy and a good deputy. But the mission of the Department of Energy in the United States is nuclear energy. That's what it was created for. That's what it's always done. No president has ever designated the Secretary of Energy to be the Secretary of all of energy, from wind to coal and everything in between. And that's really what's missing, because energy in the United States government is spread out over 14 or 15 different major agencies. That has spawned over 30 oversight committees and subcommittees on Capitol Hill. You cannot do strategic thinking with that kind of an organization. You just can't. As a matter of fact, and I've said this publicly and I know it to be true, the Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for more energy policy in this country than the Department of Energy. That's just a fact. We can fix that. The president can fix that. It seems to me that in the 2 years that I was in the White House, I came to the White House thinking about energy and how we were going to, try to do something and convince, people that energy is a security challenge. So energy security is real. It needs to be thought about, and we need to have a strategic plan for how we go into the future, both nationally and internationally. Cyber security is a security challenge. And we got that done. We do have cybersecurity now as a serious plank holder in the National Security Council. We do not have energy as a serious stakeholder in the National Security Council. And the Secretary of Energy has not been given the lapel pin that says, I am responsible for energy. We need that. And if you get that, then you can have some strategic thinking and you can develop a strategic plan. And it's I think eventually we will do it. I don't know what it takes to get it done, but I think we need to talk about it, and we need to really encourage our elected representatives to really lean on that issue until we get it done. Now, the good news is the private sector, the governors, generally speaking, the local authorities generally get it. They know that this is about jobs, this is about economy, this is about innovation, this is about national leadership, and some of them are doing quite well. But Washington, in my view, has not led from the front on this, and critically needs to. It's just that simple.
Let's talk about energy policy, and I know that you believe, and it remains a controversial proposition, but you believe that the Keystone Pipeline XL, this 1,600-mile stretch of pipeline from Alberta in Canada down to the Texas Gulf Coast, should be part of our energy policy. In fact, I think you said on Capitol Hill that if we wanted to make Vladimir Putin's day, we would reject Keystone. Yeah. What did you mean by that? How did you come to the determination in your own mind that this was an essential objective?
Well, when you look at the Russian economy and you look at what power Russia has besides nuclear weapons. Energy is an instrument of power in his mind, and he's exercising that over the Europeans, and will continue to do that. So if you're Vladimir Putin, the one thing you don't want to hear from his counterpart in Washington is that the U.S. is going to do anything that's going to upset the current balance of power with regard to energy in Europe. That would not be a good news story for him. On the other hand, we have the opportunity of possessing within our borders, and largely Canadian and some Mexican borders, unbelievable energy potential. And we have to decide what we're going to do with that. And I think that the Keystone Pipeline has really become the symbol, for a very short pipeline, given all the pipelines that exist, in the country, and pipelines that already exist between us and Canada. It has become a symbol of whether energy is going to play a key role. Are we going to reject a NATO ally to our north, who really cares about the environment, by the way, and wants their product to be subjected to stringent regulations? Or are we going to force them to build pipelines to the west and ship it to a country like China that has no regulations for the environment or anything else, and no respect for it? So to me, it's a slam dunk question. Symbolically, if the pipeline isn't built, it will be interpreted as a walk away from a strategic decision that is in our interest, in our own interest. In my lifetime, about every 10 years, somebody has predicted the decline of the United States. I was a child and I was a teenager in France, and when the Russians launched Sputnik, some of you, I can tell, are old enough to remember Sputnik, but Sputnik was the first satellite to be launched, and it made this very irritating beeping sound every time it went around the planet, just to show the U.S. that we're up there and you're not. It had a cathartic effect on the United States, and it prompted John F. Kennedy to say to launch the Man on the Moon project, and it materially changed. It changed us. I mean, we rose to the challenge. We did what we had to do. We beat the Russians to the moon, and the rest is kind of history. But these challenges keep coming up. You can't rest on your laurels if you're number one. I remember a Sports Illustrated cover with Wilt Chamberlain. I'm really a basketball aficionado, but in the 60s, Wilt Chamberlain was at the height of his powers, and the cover said, "Nobody likes Goliath." He was so dominant. Doesn't mean he won every championship, but he was so dominant as an individual. The United States is a little bit like that. We're Goliath, and we're the ones that everybody compares themselves to. But with regard to decline, and those of you who are historians here understand better than I that every civilization of any consequence, every one of them comes to an end at some point. And usually the end comes for one of two ways. Historically, they're either conquered or they collapse from within. And they collapse from within because they weren't able to change with the times. Same thing with big companies that collapse from within because they couldn't change to meet the competitive threats. Kodak, for example, and others that we all know about. Countries are just like that. There is nothing that is in Scripture that says the United States is destined to be the number one country in the world forever. It will only happen if we change with the times. It will only happen if we understand that there's some things we must do, however difficult, to maintain that elite status. And my definition of decline for a nation or an empire or whatever you want to call it, or a company, is decline starts when you can no longer bring yourself to do those things that you know need to be done. And when you look at the problems that we face with our debt and debt to wealth ratio in this country, to not tackle that issue is irresponsible. And it's irresponsible and almost immoral in terms of what we're going to give our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. I mean, it just has to be done. We know it. It has to be done. Energy has to be done. It has to be done for us, I mean, for our future. And we have to do it right. So I apologize for the long answer, but that's kind of my thinking.
We like having an hour.
Thank
it
you.
allows you to finish a thought.
Well, there's a technique in Washington. If you give long answers, you get fewer questions. So I learned that on Capitol Hill. The best questions are always the ones for the record. General, would you answer that for the record? I'd be happy to.
You called Keystone a slam dunk, and I want to have you address some of the arguments you hear made against this project. And they tend to be environmental arguments, and they tend to be one of two. They'll talk about the sands in Alberta, and they'll say this is a very dirty oil. This is going to contribute to greater global warming. Or they're referring to the pipeline itself. We could have an environmental catastrophe if something were to malfunction with the pipeline itself. There are people who just simply think that doing more oil is the wrong direction to go, that we should be looking at alternative sources of energy. So I want to have you address that. Those concerns about A, the environment, and B, about the direction of our energy policy.
Well, I think that you have to have respect for the environment. There's no question about that. I'm not a student of global climate change, but I know that we had dramatic shifts in climate on this planet long before man was able to ever be accused of doing anything to help it or harm it. So I think obviously history suggests that there are cyclic changes to our environment. Now, having said that, I don't think that it's fair to say that man alone is causing whatever climate changes are ongoing. We just had one of the coldest winters on record in Washington, D.C., and nobody's talking about global warming there, I can tell you. But I think we should just be fair about it. We shouldn't, with this good news development in shale oil and gas, we shouldn't just throw all of our eggs in one basket and just commit to do that. Say we don't need anything else. We have it all, and by the way, we need it all. And we need to continue to be leaders. We need to continue to develop the technologies. One of these days we'll have clean coal technology. We just need to, you can't hurry technology, but you need to invest in it. You need to do the R&D that goes with it, and sooner or later we'll have those breakthroughs. But on the other hand, just because you want to be ecumenical about this doesn't necessarily mean that you want to do things that are against your own interest. And the transmission of oil from Canada to be refined in our refineries is an economic issue. It's a jobs issue. It's progress. There are ways in which we can do this that are much safer than what we're doing right now. There's a technology that I'm aware of that had it been installed in those Canadian trains that had this horrific accident, would have probably saved 41 lives. I mean, there's an insert that you can put into pipelines that will preclude pipelines from exploding if they're kinetically shocked. So there's no doubt in my mind that with the range of transmission lines and modalities that we have, that we can do this very safely. And And as I said, the consequence for not doing it is going to be to fracture good relations with our neighbors to the north, which they've already been very patient, and probably result in all of that oil going to another country that is far less regulated than we are. And if you want to talk about climate damage, that's where that would happen, more so than here. So, I've listened to all the arguments. I appeared in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee just a few weeks ago with a good friend of mine from the Chamber of Commerce and two people who were very much opposed to the Keystone. But I don't see the argument, to be honest with you. I think it's our national interest. It's in our international interest, and especially with people like Mr. Putin playing the energy card the way he is, that we can respond in kind, and actually, to use the bridge term, we can trump him.
In terms of jobs, I've seen wildly differing estimates on how many jobs Keystone create. President Obama said about a year ago, he was, I don't want to say he was dismissive of it, but he said something to the effect that you're talking about 2,000 jobs, and after it's built, maybe 35 to 50 people to run it. And yet you hear others who will say 42,000 jobs, not 2,000, but 42,000 jobs. I think it's hard sometimes for the American public to sort through all of this. What does it mean in terms of the economics of it, job creation?
Well, I mean, there's no question that if you're building something that's going to create jobs, and you're going to have maintenance of it. You're going to have people man it. You're going to have to make sure that, it's inspected and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I haven't, I know the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has calculated somewhere around 20, 30, 40,000 jobs, but
some of those spin-off jobs, I assume.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, there's no question about the economic impact, for the relationship, and there's no question that I think that it will create jobs. I don't know how many.
So the State Department has been studying this for about 5 years, and it appeared that there might be a decision this summer or early this fall on Keystone, and now it appears, based on what happened last week, that will probably not be the case, and it will happen after the midterm elections. What's your reaction to the latest delay?
I'm extremely disappointed. Actually, the State Department has, I think, conducted 5 different environmental impact statements, and each one of them has shown that it would have little to no appreciable impact on the environment, negative impact on the environment. I don't know what else you need, to be honest with you. But, this is one of those things where you want our decision makers to make decisions that are in the best interest of the country, for national security reasons, for international security reasons, especially now, especially with Mr. Putin acting the way he is. I mean, it's not just economic, it's geopolitical, geostrategic. And it doesn't have to just be linked to Keystone, by the way. I mean, there's other ways in which the United States could lead an effort, for example, to build pipelines from southern Iraq all the way through Kurdistan into Turkey, into the Mediterranean, that would bypass Russia as well. I mean, we could champion that cause and give the Iraqis and the Kurds and the Turks something all three really want. They just can't figure out how to do it because of their history. We could help them do that. We could help champion north-south pipelines in Europe, and that would be another way. So there's any number of ways, in addition to our own requirements and our own needs, to adjust our policies, our laws, our export policies, to do this, and to symbolically send the big message. I think Keystone's part of that message.
You worked with President Obama closely for a couple of years. What's your gut tell you about what he'll ultimately decide on this?
I think ultimately, I mean, I would hope I'm not wrong, but I think ultimately the president will do what's right for in the national interest. I'm not a political person. I'm not. I mean, people think I'm a Democrat because I worked for a Democratic president. As spending 40 years in the military, you get pretty much conditioned to, heightened respect for the commander-in-chief, whoever it is, whatever party. My interest in going back in government was purely to serve the country, not a partisan, not a political party. And the president and I, when we talked about this in 2008, about this possibility, I told him that one of the only condition that I would put on it is that national security issues are not political issues. They are national security issues. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans own national security. And if he was willing to go along with that in terms of how we did our work in the National Security Council, that it would not be tainted by partisan policy, then I would be happy to serve. And by and large, in almost 2 years that I was there, I can give you chapter and verse that I thought the president lived up to what he said. And I'm hopeful that on this Keystone Pipeline issue and on energy more broadly as a national security issue that he will come around and do the right thing.
You described earlier in the session your moment back in the 70s in your Volkswagen Beetle, where you were listening to the radio and trying to fill up your gas tank when gas was a bit more challenging to come by.
It was just going over $1 a gallon. And that was for those of you who remember that was a real defining moment when you had to pay $1 to get a gallon of gas. Unbelievable.
So another defining moment for you was when you were the Supreme Allied Commander with NATO, and we had 9/11. And it was the threats of what could come down the road by Al-Qaeda. Energy-related threats.
Right.
There was another defining moment.
There was. So like any other military guy, I mean, I was over in NATO, and Osama bin Laden was at the peak of his powers, and he was exhorting his followers to attack the soft underbelly of capitalism, and that's the energy and the infrastructure, ports, transmission lines, you name it. And so we undertook a quick study in Europe. We had, I think, 19 countries at the time. In 2004, we went to 26 countries, but we did a quick study to look at our vulnerabilities along the lines of transporting energy through the choke points, the Suez Canal, Straits of Gibraltar, and so on. And also the infrastructure, the grids, the terminals, and everything. We found out that we were very vulnerable. Now, for one reason or the other, that those attacks never really transpired. But it still should cause us to look at the vulnerability that we have, both domestically and internationally, but domestically for sure, with our aging infrastructure and the vulnerability of the grid, and the real probability that major cyber attacks in the future are possible. They're happening already here and there. And what do we do about those kinds of threats? So energy, cybersecurity, all of those things can bring economies to a crashing stop, or at least inflict tremendous damage on our way of life. Those are things that we need to hear more about, and we need to do more about.
I have one more question, and then we'll take questions from the audience here. My final question deals with NATO, because you talked about the opportunity that is actually present for NATO and the European Union and some of the progress that could be made. Do you still find NATO, and I know you do because I read a recent op-ed piece you did with former Defense Secretary Cohen, you still feel that it's more important than ever. Do you think that's the generally held opinion of NATO today?
No, probably not. I happen to feel that way because I think if we didn't have an organization like NATO, we would be busy trying to invent one. So NATO, a little bit of history. NATO was conceived as a defensive, reactive alliance. And by that, it meant that NATO doctrine was never to deliver the first blow against the Soviet Union, but to absorb the first blow and retaliate with what we call mutually assured destruction, but overwhelmingly. That it was so unacceptable and so unthinkable that nobody in his right mind would ever think about doing that. And essentially, although risky, it proved out to be correct. The problem that NATO has in the 21st century is that there is probably not going to be another world war in the 20th century mode. I happen to think there is a world war going on. The threats are more asymmetric and harder to kind of grasp because you don't have a clear enemy behind a clear border like we used to have. I mean, I remember my parents used to talk about the Iron Curtain when I was a kid, and in my mind, I was visualizing that somewhere on this planet there was this gigantic Iron Curtain, and all the bad people in the world lived on that side, and all the good people lived on this side. I mean, that's, when you're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, that's living in post-war Europe, as I was. That was it. I mean, that was a big, bad Russian machine. But NATO now has to be transformed a little bit, and they're trying. But it's really hard when you have to get 28 countries to agree on any one thing to do anything. So NATO is generally slow. They've shown some indications in Libya that they might be coming out of that. For instance, in Libya, they agreed to a NATO mission without unanimous agreement. And the Germans sat it out, and other countries took it on. So that was positive. But I think that NATO has to be more proactive than reactive. And by proactive, I don't mean you go to war in every country. I mean you've got 28 of the most developed countries on the planet whose armed forces are sitting around waiting for the next war to happen, essentially. And then they want to talk about it for 6 months or a year and then finally do something about it. Whereas I think if you buy into this idea of this three-pronged engagement strategy of security, economic development, and governance and rule of law, that you could if there was a will to do this, I mean, you could proactively, say, prevent a country like Nigeria from becoming the next Iraq or Afghanistan in the next 10 years, which is completely possible. And the largest economy in Africa could actually crumble under the pressures of radical fundamentalism. I mean, all the elements are there. So the question is, in this 21st century, is if that's not good, and you don't want that to happen, what can you do now to prevent it? And I think proactive engagement is much cheaper, much, much cheaper in terms of resources and lives expended than reactive policies that get us into decades of presence in a couple of countries that are barely grateful for their sacrifice.
Here's my final question. How much damage was done by the Edward Snowden NSA revelations with some of our European allies, some of the members of NATO, who found out that they were being spied on?
A huge amount of damage.
Huge amount.
Huge amount. Yeah. Very, very, our allies take that very personally. Mm-hmm. There's a little hypocrisy there because, name me one country that doesn't, try to get a leg up on another country, even if you're friends and allies. That's just, it's just what you do. You have, but these revelations were very hurtful to our national security, and we'll learn from it. Mm-hmm. And if we were wrong in some areas, we'll make our own corrections. I mean, this country has the best ability of any country in the world to self-correct. When we're wrong, we generally beat ourselves up unmercifully for twice as long as we should, but we eventually will fix it, and that's a good thing.
Let's take a few questions from the audience. Just raise your hand, as we often do. I'll remind people who are in the seating bowl to press down on the little rim, not the ball, but on the rim, and then we can all hear your question. So I'll begin right here. Yes, sir. Can you press down on that, please? That the rim. Yeah, if you could just hold that down, that'd be good. That's fine.
General, with the asymmetric warfare that you alluded to and all of the other conflicts, how does this all play together with the drawdown of American troops? And I'm very concerned about that. I'd be very interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. Well, after every conflict, there is a drawdown. And there's a drawdown in two ways. One is manpower, and the other is resources. And that's what's going on now. And I think that that we have to be extremely careful that we don't go too far. We still have, still have global responsibilities. I consider the fact that we are still invited to have geographical commands in different parts of the world as a huge national asset. What other country in the world has unified commands in the Pacific and South America, in the Arab countries, in Europe and the like? And those are national assets, and there's sometimes a tendency to want to pull those back before you close one of our bases here in the U.S., and that would be a catastrophic mistake in my mind. But there's no question that when you're not fighting two wars simultaneously, that some sort of realignment has to take place. But we should be very careful about the pendulum swinging too far. And I'm afraid that with the sequestration, which is really, in my view, a demonstration of a political unwillingness to do the right thing, then you could go too far. And I think I'd be very careful about that.
Let me take other questions. Let me go here, and then I'll come over there. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
First of all, General, thank you from one grunt to another for the service that you and your family gave to our country.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Thank you.
I said I want to thank you and your family for the service you've given
Thank
to
you
our
very much.
country.
Thank you, sir.
I want to make a question and observation. I think some of the European leaders are envious, resentful, jealous, and somewhat suspicious to the United States in tying their economic and military future, as it were, to the oil industry in the United States. And I wanted to see what your comment was on that.
Sorry, can you? I just couldn't hear very well.
It was about the actions of others and how they feel about America in terms.
Yeah, some of the European leaders they've always been liking to play the U.S. against the Russians and the Russians against the U.S. And for them who are smart enough or perhaps not smart enough to use us against the Russians for their benefit, and how anxious are they to tie themselves to their future to the United States?
Okay, thank you.
Well, I mean, it is really a defining moment for the Europeans. And when I was over in Prague just a few weeks ago, and I appeared on a panel with the former Polish president, the former president of Germany, and we were talking obviously about Russia and Europe and the EU, and I told them frankly, I said, look, this is an opportunity for you to show us what you're made out of. Nobody's asking you to go to war. I mean, we're not going to have a war over Crimea, but this is serious. And why would you expect the United States to be more concerned about what's going on in Europe than the Europeans are? So, and that's a legitimate question in this 21st century. And my feeling is that if the Europeans manage to rally around this issue and make decisions that are in their own interest, then they'll find us right with them. But I think it's probably unfair for us now, especially now that the Europeans are, the post-war recovery is done. They're advanced societies and they govern themselves. They know what to do. They have technology. It's unfair for us to continue to bankroll what they won't pay for. And I said, you don't have to worry about us bilaterally with Russia. We're going to respond bilaterally. Your concern should be, are we going to respond multilaterally, which is the better way? Is the transatlantic link as important to us as it is to you? And your actions are going to drive that. And that's fair. And I think that's really kind of what most people feel like in this country. That's legitimate. So I'm hopeful that, that the unintended consequences that Mr. Putin would not like to see happen actually happen. And the Europeans should decide that they are collectively united around the European Union. They should decide to live up to their commitments of the Prague Summit of 2002, the NATO Prague Summit, where they pledged 2% of their each individual national GDPs for security and national defense, and they should fix that. And if they do, I think that the partnership with the U.S. will be a good one. But if they don't, then we'll draw some lessons from that as well.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? We'll go down here and then we'll. Sure.
Well, a few years ago, I read a book, United States of Europe, and in that book, it suggested that with the NATO organization, the United States covers a large proportion of the European military budget, and that is one of the things that allows them to provide through the government the healthcare programs that they do. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, Europeans, they're all a little bit different, but they basically have a philosophy that the government. I'm thinking of the country I grew up in. I grew up in France, and I moved there when I was 2.5 and came home when I was about 17. So I'm used to kind of a socialized, womb-to-tomb governmental concept of how they run their countries. But nobody at that time planned for massive immigration, illegal and otherwise. And France, for example, has been subjected to incredible amount of immigrations from Africa. And that has kind of just jolted the whole system. The system is fine if you want to live under it, but as long as the borders are secure and you don't get undue strains on the organization. But yeah, there's no question that since 1945, all the way through the Marshall Plan and everything else, that the United States was, single-handedly almost responsible for rebuilding Japan and post-war Europe. And those days are now gone. And our responsibilities to continue to do anything like that, I think, are also gone. And the Europeans are going to have to be an equal partner here. It's just not right that they don't do their fair share. And it's going to take leadership, and it's going to take somebody like Mr. Putin maybe to, say, hello, time to wake up, because the world has changed, but it hasn't really changed that much. One guy can make a difference. And by the way, there's a lot of criticism about the administration about a failed reset policy with Russia. Reset policy didn't fail. What happened was they changed presidents, and one man can make a difference in Russia. But in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, we cooperated with President Medvedev and his staff and passed the START treaty, which was a good treaty for both sides, a good treaty for people who care about proliferation. We exchanged intelligence on Iran. We had a common policy on Iran. So those first 2 years were pretty good. And we thought, and I thought, that we'd kind of crossed that bridge with the Russians until Mr. Putin came back in power, and we realized that this is a whole different animal, a whole different human, with a very serious preconceived notions about how he wants to run his country.
Steve, I'm going to ask you to go back here. There's a gentleman who's got his hand up. If you can wait for the microphone so we can hear your question. Thanks.
You talked about the pipeline, and I read an article that you wrote earlier, and you talked about the natural gas, getting LNG exports, which I believe the administration has already expanded since last year. But my concern with this energy policy that we don't have is you talked about the pipeline that you wanted to build through Iraq over to Turkey. And originally, back in 2008, 2009, I believe Putin went to Bulgaria and got the Bulgarian oil. Now there's oil in the Black Sea right off of Crimea. And when you look at what the Russians are doing, what the Chinese are doing, half of the oil in Iraq is now going to China. China's also building a pipeline in Iraq. So, it looks like if we don't have a real good energy policy, how are we going to stay on top of this world situation that you talk about? And I believe one of the articles you wrote, you said if we don't approve the Keystone Pipeline, it would embolden Putin. I think that was the exact words you used. So to me, you talked about will, and you talked about Kennedy doing the Sputnik. Well, where is that emphasis to the president now to forget about some of these carbon initiatives that he worries about so much when he first got elected? Where is that will from this president?
Well, that's a good question. The only thing worse than no policy is bad policy. And I worry about that. And I think that this country's, if the polls are right, I think the last one was 65% of Americans who were polled believe that the pipeline should be built. I mean, that's a pretty huge number. But I just don't know how we do it. I don't know how we achieve our potential on energy without some sort of strategic document, without an agency that is chartered to manage the entire energy portfolio in a way that when you come to the Situation Room in the White House, like we do so often with the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of State on global issues, the Energy Secretary ought to have a place at that table, and so should the Secretary of Commerce. And it's another way of saying that if you don't have a strategy, you really don't have much of anything. And you cannot afford to not have a comprehensive energy strategy that people can understand, businesses could plan on. And frankly, this is a way in which the public and the private sector can come together and do something that's good for the country and enhances our leadership position in the world. And we're suffering. I mean, we're losing market share, to use a business term, in influence. We've lost it in Europe. We've certainly lost it in the Arabian Gulf. And the reason we've lost it is simply because, for instance, in the Arab world, we lost it because of our initial reaction to the way President Mubarak was deposed in Egypt, and our overall reaction to the Arab Spring, where our friends and allies have kind of said, okay, now we know how you're going to react if it happens in our country. So thank you very much. And the second reason we've lost clout in the Arab world is because of the rise of our potential in energy, which means that OPEC is less relevant. I mean, how many of you have ever read a newspaper in the last year where you read anything about the next meeting of OPEC ministers? How many of you care? That's I remember just 10 years ago, though, when the OPEC ministers were meeting, and everybody just hold on to the table and hope that the price for a barrel of oil wasn't going to go over $100. that's just an example of how it's changed. I mean, it's not to say that OPEC isn't relevant. It is. But we should be working with OPEC to formulate a broader, comprehensive international energy policy that benefits the haves and the have-nots and actually punishes and dissuades people like Mr. Putin.
Well, since General Jones is a military man, we're going to wrap things up on time today. Before we go, I just wanted to mention...
Take one more?
Yeah, if you'd like to take one.
This gentleman
Sure.
had his hand up for...
Yeah, I've heard the word strategy used a lot. And let's presume that the pipeline will be built, and that'll send a message to Putin that, okay, we're going to build a pipeline. There's a part of me that says that message is we believe in oil. And the other part of me believes that the future for this world is not in oil because we can't continue to rely on petrochemicals and or petrodictators and petroleum. We need...
Okay, is
You know,
it
you
okay? I mean,
spoke about-
you've shown your message now. Can we just kind of move on?
I'd like to complete the question. Wouldn't it put more fear in...
Fair and balanced reporting. And I would hope that you would cover the other environmental side.
Absolutely.
That goes back before Putin and this Cold War ruse that's been happening now. It goes back 6-7 years in terms of the future of our children and our ability to breathe on Earth. As we talk about the XL pipeline, we talk about tar sands that is so crude that soaks up water in our environment and energy to the detriment of this earth and our mother. So this is going in the wrong direction and should hold a forum based upon the other side of this story.
Absolutely
Thank
will.
you.
Yeah, okay,
You're welcome.
Thank you.
With that gentleman's thoughts in mind.
Wouldn't it put more fear into Putin, President Putin, if we were to say, okay, we're building the pipeline, but that's where our major investments in oil and petroleum ends and coal ends, carbon ends. We're going to have another space race, but it's going to be an energy race into alternatives to oil, and put the fear into Mr. Putin that the educational capabilities, the research capabilities of Canada, the United States, was focused on the future of energy, because quite frankly, I have to disagree with you on the point you made about whether or not man contributes to global warming. I think NASA is pretty clear on that we do. So why not look to the future and put all our energy and our resources into the future, which would be an alternative to carbon fuels?
You know, I completely agree with you on that, and that's what's called a strategic energy policy. And if we had that, I think we'd be great.
But not around oil.
Sorry?
But not around oil, just more components.
No, not around oil. No, we have it all and we need it all. And we need to properly invest and not become, I think the worst thing that could happen is we just get seduced by the fact that we've got a lot of oil and gas and we'll just kind of ride it out until we run out. That's not strategic. That's very tactical and very shallow in my view. So no, I completely agree with you. And on the environmental question, my only point, you may disagree with it, was that I don't think man is uniquely responsible for what goes on in climate. I think the history of the world shows that there are ice ages, there are periods of warming, there's a lot more science that goes into that than just what happens that's man-made. That's all.
We
shouldn't make it worse. I agree with you.
We are going to wrap things up there. I did want to mention before we go 3 other events that will close out the spring here at the law school. Tomorrow we will be joined by a music mogul turned social entrepreneur, Kenny Gamble, who will be here in the law school. On Wednesday, U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin will be here at the law school. And on May 15th, we'll be holding a day-long conference on the subject of political polarization in southeast Wisconsin. There's been some fascinating new data crunching going on by Craig Gilbert, the Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, who's been a fellow here at the law school for the last 6 months. He's been working closely with Charles Franklin. They have some fascinating numbers to share, and we'll talk about the policy implications and the implications for political engagement that come with our growing polarization. So having said that, I'd like to thank all of you in the room for your time, your opinions, all of the opinions in the room. And I'd most of all like to thank General James Jones for coming to Marquette Law School today. General, thank you.
Thank you very much.